The obese girl was forced to leave town until the mountain man brought her home in front of everyone. The winter of 1887 came early to Silver Ridge, a mining town clinging to the eastern slopes of the Colorado Rockies, like a barnacle to a ship's hull. Snow dusted the crooked rooftops of hastily built cabins, and smoke curled from stone chimneys into a sky the color of old pewter. The town had sprung up 5 years earlier when prospectors found a promising silver vein, but lately the mines had been yielding less and less, and desperation had settled over the community like fog in a valley. Elsie Whitmore stood at the edge of the town square, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. At 23 years old, she was a large woman, broad-shouldered and heavy-set, and the townspeople had never let her forget it. She pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she watched the other residents hurry past, their eyes sliding away from her as if she were invisible, or worse, as if she were something shameful they preferred not to acknowledge. She had learned to expect this treatment. Ever since her parents died in a mine collapse 3 years ago, leaving her alone in the world, the town had regarded her with a mixture of pity and contempt. The women whispered behind their hands about her size, speculating cruelly about how someone with so little could afford to eat so much. The men either ignored her completely or made crude jokes when they thought she couldn't hear. Only old Mrs. Chin at the general store treated her with consistent kindness, occasionally slipping her day-old bread or bruised apples. What the townspeople didn't know what Elsie had kept carefully hidden was where most of her meager earnings actually went. 3 times a week, she made the treacherous climb to the caves near the mountain's base, where a small group of orphaned children had taken refuge. There were 5 of them, Emma and Samuel, siblings aged 8 and 10, Thomas, a 7-year-old boy whose father had died in the same collapse that killed Elsie's parents, and twins, Maria and Rosa, barely 6 years old, whose mother had succumbed to pneumonia the previous winter. The children survived on whatever scraps Elsie could bring them, along with the occasional rabbit they managed to trap. She had tried to bring them into town, to find them proper homes, but the townspeople had turned her away. "We can barely feed our own," they'd said. "There's no room for more mouths." So Elsie did what she could, splitting her own rations and skipping meals to ensure the children didn't starve. On that particular morning in late November, Elsie arrived at the town square to find a crowd gathering near the mine office. Her stomach clenched with unease. Large gatherings in Silver Ridge usually meant bad news, another accident, another collapse, another family torn apart by the unforgiving mountain. But as she drew closer, she heard her own name being spoken, and the unease bloomed into full-fledged dread. "Elsie Whitmore!" The voice belonged to Marcus Blackwood, the mine foreman and de facto leader of the town. He was a tall, lean man with a face like weathered leather and eyes as cold as creek water in January. "Step forward." The crowd parted, creating a narrow pathway, and Elsie felt dozens of eyes boring into her as she walked toward Blackwood. Her legs trembled, but she kept her chin up, refusing to show weakness. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Blackwood held up a ledger book, his expression thunderous. "The community food stores have been audited, and we're coming up short. 3 weeks' worth of supplies, flour, dried meat, beans all missing. And do you know what I discovered?" He paused dramatically, letting the silence stretch. "That you've been seen near the storage shed at odd hours. Multiple witnesses have come forward. Elsie's heart hammered against her ribs. I, I can explain. Explain? A woman's voice cut through the cold air. It was Martha Donnelly, the banker's wife, her face pinched with righteous anger. We all know what happened. You stole from the community stores to feed yourself. Look at you. It's obvious where all that food went. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Elsie felt her face burning despite the cold. That's not true. I never— Liar! Another voice, male this time. John Garrett, whose son worked in the mines. My family has been going hungry because of you. My wife can barely make the ration stretch, and all the while you've been helping yourself to our supplies. I was feeding the children. Elsie's voice broke as she tried to defend herself. The orphans up in the mountain caves, they're starving. I only took what I needed to keep them alive. What children? Blackwood's eyes narrowed. There are no children in those caves. This is just another one of your lies, Miss Whitmore. You stole food to fill your own belly, and now you're trying to cover it up with a convenient fairy tale. It's not a fairy tale. They're real. Emma, Samuel, Thomas, Maria, and Rosa, they're living up there because no one in this town would take them in. Tears of frustration stung Elsie's eyes. You all turned them away. You said there wasn't enough food for them, so I— Enough! Blackwood's voice cracked like a whip. You are a thief and a liar, Elsie Whitmore. The council has decided you have until sunset to gather your belongings and leave Silver Ridge. If you're still here come morning, you'll be arrested and charged with theft. The crowd erupted in shouts of approval. Someone threw a stone that struck Elsie's shoulder, making her stumble. Another followed, then another. She raised her arms to shield her face as the townspeople she had lived among for years hurled both rocks and insults. Thief! Greedy pig! You should be ashamed. Through the chaos, Elsie caught sight of Mrs. Chen standing at the edge of the crowd, her weathered face etched with sorrow. The old woman shook her head slightly, as if to say there was nothing she could do. Then she turned and walked away, and Elsie felt utterly, completely alone. She was still standing there, arms wrapped around herself, when a deep voice cut through the commotion like an axe through timber. That's enough. The crowd fell silent and turned as one to see who had spoken. Elsie looked up through tear-blurred eyes and saw a man she recognized only vaguely, someone she'd glimpsed occasionally on the rare occasions he came down from the mountains for supplies. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair streaked with gray and a thick beard that obscured most of his face. He wore buckskin clothing and heavy boots, and there was something about the way he carried himself, a quiet, dangerous authority that made people instinctively step back. "Who are you to interfere?" Blackwood demanded, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Name's Jack Morrison," the man said, his voice low and rough from disuse. "Used to work the mines here, back before most of you arrived. I know this town, and I know how it treats people it decides aren't worth protecting." "This doesn't concern you, Morrison," Blackwood said. "This woman is a thief." "Is she?" Jack's dark eyes swept over the crowd before settling on Elsie. "Or is that just what you've decided to believe because it's convenient?" "We have witnesses!" Martha Donnelly shrilled. "She was seen—" "I don't care what she was seen doing," Jack interrupted, his voice hardening. "I want to know what evidence you have that she stole anything, because from where I'm standing, all I see is a young woman being run out of town by people who've already decided she's guilty." Blackwood's face reddened. The evidence is clear. The food is missing, and she admits to taking it." "She admitted to feeding orphaned children," Jack corrected. "Children that you all apparently turned away. That's not theft. That's basic human decency, which seems to be in short supply around here." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few people had the grace to look ashamed, but most remained stubbornly angry, as if Jack's words were a personal attack. "I want a public hearing," Jack declared. "A fair trial where Miss Whitmore can present her side of the story and where actual evidence, not just gossip and prejudice, is examined." "We don't owe her or you anything," Garrett shouted. "She's been judged, and the decision stands." Jack took a step forward, and despite being outnumbered 50-1, the crowd instinctively retreated. There was something in his bearing, some quality forged by years of solitary living in the mountains, that spoke of a man who would not be easily swayed or intimidated. "Then you're no better than thieves yourselves," he said quietly, "running an innocent woman out of town to cover up your own failings. Is that really the kind of community you want Silver Ridge to be?" For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Blackwood cleared his throat. "Fine. We'll hold a hearing tomorrow morning, but I warn you, Morrison, if she's found guilty, the punishment will be even harsher for wasting our time." Jack nodded curtly. "That's all I ask. A fair chance." As the crowd began to disperse, muttering amongst themselves, Jack turned to Elsie. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a startling shade of gray-blue, like storm clouds over the mountains. There was pain in those eyes, old and deep, but also a fierce protectiveness that made her throat tighten. "Thank you," she whispered, "but you shouldn't have done that. They'll turn on you now, too." "Let them try," Jack said simply. He glanced toward the mountains, then back at her. "These children you mentioned, are they really up there?" Elsie nodded. "In the caves, about 2 miles north of here. I was planning to check on them this afternoon, but now—" She gestured helplessly at her situation. "I'll go," Jack said. "Show me where." They hiked through the snow together, Elsie leading the way along paths she had walked so many times she could navigate them blindfolded. Jack followed silently, his long strides easily keeping pace with hers despite the difficult terrain. As they climbed, Elsie found herself wondering about this strange mountain man who had appeared so suddenly to defend her. "Why did you help me?" she asked finally, the question bursting out before she could stop herself. "You don't even know me." Jack was quiet for so long that Elsie thought he might not answer. Then softly, "I had a wife once, Sarah. She was kind, like you, always helping others, always seeing the good in people even when they didn't deserve it." His voice grew rougher. The townspeople turned on her, too, when times got hard, accused her of things she didn't do, said terrible things about her. I was working in the mines, couldn't protect her. By the time I realized what was happening—" He trailed off, and Elsie heard the weight of old grief in his silence. "She died, believing no one cared. I won't let that happen to someone else, not again." They reached the caves as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The children emerged cautiously from the shadows, their thin faces lighting up when they saw Elsie. Emma, the oldest, rushed forward first, followed quickly by the others. "Miss Elsie, we were worried. You're later than usual." "I'm sorry, sweetheart," Elsie said, kneeling to hug the girl despite the cold ground. "I had some trouble in town, but I brought someone who can help." She gestured to Jack, who had stopped a few paces back, his expression unreadable. The children studied him with the wariness of young animals, but when he slowly knelt and pulled out a small sack of dried venison from his pack, their caution melted away. "I'm Jack," he said gently. "Miss Elsie tells me you've been living up here on your own. That takes real courage." As the children eagerly accepted the food, Jack examined their makeshift shelter with a critical eye. It was pitifully inadequate, just an overhang of rock with some scraps of canvas stretched across the opening. No proper bedding, no real protection from the elements. It was a miracle they'd survived this long. "This won't do," he muttered, "not with winter coming on hard." He looked at Elsie. "Tomorrow, after the hearing, we'll need to make some changes, one way or another." That night, Elsie barely slept. She lay in her small cabin, staring at the ceiling and wondering what the morning would bring. Would anyone believe her? Would Jack's intervention make any difference? Or would it just make things worse? When dawn broke gray and cold, she dressed in her best dress, a faded blue calico that had belonged to her mother, and walked to the town hall with her head held high. Jack was already there, standing at the back of the room with his arms crossed. He nodded to her as she entered, and the simple gesture gave her strength. The hearing began with Blackwood presenting his case. He was eloquent and persuasive, painting Elsie as a conniving thief who had taken advantage of the community's trust. He presented the ledgers showing the missing supplies, and called witness after witness who testified to seeing Elsie near the storage shed. Then it was Elsie's turn to speak. She stood before the assembled townspeople and told them about the children, their names, their stories, how they'd ended up alone and forgotten. She described the caves where they lived, the meager meals she'd cobbled together for them, her failed attempts to find them homes in town. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "I'm asking you to remember what it means to be human. Those children didn't choose to be orphans. They didn't ask for this life. And yes, I took food from the community stores to feed them, but I did it because no one else would help. Because when I asked, when I begged you, all turned your backs." The room was silent when she finished. Then Jack stood and walked to the front of the room. "I have something to add," he said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle of papers. "I went to the mine office last night and did some checking of my own. These are the supply orders for the past 6 months. He spread them on the table before Blackwood. "According to these records, the mine has been ordering significantly more food than what's been distributed to the community stores. Where's the rest of it, Blackwood?" The mine foreman's face went pale, then red. Those are private. You had no right." "Answer the question," Jack said, his voice deadly calm. "Where is the food?" Blackwood looked around wildly, as if seeking escape. Then, suddenly, 3 of his men, burly miners who served as his personal enforcers, rushed forward. They grabbed Jack, trying to drag him away from the table, but Jack was ready. He threw off the first man with a powerful shove, ducked under the second man's punch, and drove his fist into the third man's stomach. The room erupted into chaos. People were shouting, some trying to intervene, others scrambling to get out of the way. Elsie watched in horror as Jack fought against all 3 men, holding his own but clearly outnumbered. Without thinking, she rushed forward. One of the men had grabbed a wooden chair and was raising it above his head, preparing to bring it down on Jack's skull. Elsie threw herself between them, and the chair struck her back instead. Pain exploded through her body, and she fell to her knees, gasping. "Elsie!" Jack's voice, sharp with concern, cut through the noise. He caught her before she could fall completely, then turned to face the men with an expression of such cold fury that they actually backed away. The violence stopped as suddenly as it had begun. In the stunned silence that followed, Jack helped Elsie to a chair and turned to address the crowd. "This is what you've become," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "So afraid of the truth that you'd rather attack someone than face it. Blackwood has been stealing from all of you and using Miss Whitmore as a convenient scapegoat. And you were all so eager to believe it because it was easier than admitting you'd been cruel to an innocent woman." He picked up the papers again and held them high. "These records don't lie. Blackwood ordered 3 times the amount of food that made it to the community stores. He's been selling the surplus to other mining towns and pocketing the profit. Miss Whitmore took a few bags of flour and beans to feed starving children. Blackwood stole enough to feed this entire town for a year. So tell me, who's the real thief here?" All eyes turned to Blackwood, who had gone the color of old parchment. For a moment, Elsie thought he might try to deny it, but the evidence was too clear, too damning. "It's true," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did it, but the mine was failing. We needed the money to keep operations going." "You needed the money to line your own pockets," Jack corrected coldly, "and you were willing to let an innocent woman take the blame." The crowd's mood had shifted from anger at Elsie to fury at Blackwood. People began shouting accusations, demanding justice. The council members huddled together, arguing in hushed voices. Finally, the eldest among them, a gray-haired man named Wallace, stepped forward. "Marcus Blackwood, you are hereby stripped of your position as mine foreman and expelled from this town. Your assets will be seized to compensate the community for what you've stolen. And Miss Whitmore." He turned to Elsie, his expression genuinely contrite. "We owe you an apology, a profound one. We let our prejudices blind us to the truth, and for that we are deeply sorry." The apology was echoed by others in the room, though Elsie noticed that some people, including Martha Donnelly, remained sullenly silent. But it was enough, more than she'd dared to hope for. Over the following weeks, Silver Ridge slowly transformed. Jack took charge of reorganizing the mine operations, using his years of experience to make them more efficient and safer. The food stores were redistributed fairly, and for the first time in months, families had enough to eat. And the children, Emma, Samuel, Thomas, Maria, and Rosa, were brought down from the caves and integrated into the community. Families who had once claimed they had no room suddenly found space in their homes and hearts for orphans who needed shelter. Elsie helped coordinate their placement, making sure each child went to a home where they'd be loved and cared for. Through it all, Jack remained a steady presence. He moved down from his mountain cabin into a small house at the edge of town, close enough to help with the mine, but far enough to maintain some of the solitude he'd grown accustomed to. And Elsie found herself drawn to his quiet strength, the way he listened more than he spoke, the gentle way he treated the children who had come to adore him. One evening in early spring, when the snow was finally beginning to melt and the first green shoots were pushing through the dark earth, Elsie climbed up to Jack's cabin with a basket of fresh bread. He'd been working on reinforcing some of the mine shafts, and she knew he'd likely forgotten to eat lunch. She found him sitting on the porch, whittling a small wooden horse. When he saw her, he smiled a rare, genuine expression that transformed his weather-beaten face. "I was hoping you'd come by," he said, setting aside the carving. "Someone has to make sure you're taking care of yourself," Elsie replied, settling onto the bench beside him. She set the basket between them and pulled back the cloth to reveal the bread, still warm from the oven. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sharing the bread and watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and orange. Then Elsie noticed the door to Jack's cabin was ajar, and through it she could see something on the wall, a framed photograph that caught the dying light. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the cabin. Jack nodded, and she stood and walked inside. The cabin was sparse but tidy, with a few pieces of simple furniture and the smell of pine and wood smoke. But it was the photograph on the wall that drew her like a magnet. It showed a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, wearing a simple dress and holding a book. Elsie's breath caught in her throat as recognition flooded through her. "Miss Sarah," she whispered. Jack had followed her inside. "You knew her?" Elsie nodded, her eyes still fixed on the photograph. "She was my teacher when I was very young, before—" She paused, remembering. "Before my parents pulled me out of school to help with the household. I must have been 6 or 7. I remember she used to read to us poetry mostly. She had the most beautiful voice." She turned to Jack, tears streaming down her face. "She was so kind to me. Even when the other children teased me about my size, she never did. She told me I was perfect just as I was, that the world needed people with big hearts, not just small bodies." Jack's own eyes were wet as he stepped closer. "She would have been so proud of what you did, taking care of those children, standing up for what was right, even when the whole town was against you." "I wish I could have told her how much her kindness meant to me," Elsie said softly. "How those few months when she taught me shaped everything I became." "I think," Jack said, his voice rough with emotion, "that maybe this was all meant to happen this way. Sarah helped you become someone who would help others, and helping you, it's helped me remember what it feels like to care about something again, to have a purpose beyond just surviving." They stood there in the fading light, the photograph of Sarah Morrison smiling down at them, and something profound and beautiful passed between them. It wasn't just attraction, though that was there too. It was recognition, two wounded souls who had found in each other the possibility of healing. "Stay for dinner?" Jack asked, his voice tentative. "I make a decent stew, and the company would be welcome." Elsie smiled. "I'd like that." The months that followed were the happiest of Elsie's life. She and Jack spent more and more time together, working to improve conditions in the mines, organizing community events, checking on the children who had been placed with new families. Slowly, carefully, they built something neither had expected to find again: hope. The townspeople, for their part, had learned their lesson. They treated Elsie with respect now, and more than that, with genuine friendliness. Mrs. Chen had tears in her eyes the day she gave Elsie a bolt of beautiful fabric for a new dress. "For all you've done," she said simply, but it was the children who sealed Elsie and Jack's fate. One summer evening, nearly a year after the hearing, all 5 orphans appeared at Elsie's door with serious expressions. "We had a meeting," Emma announced, her young face solemn, "and we've decided something important." "Oh?" Elsie exchanged an amused glance with Jack, who had arrived for their usual evening walk. "And what's that?" "You two should get married," Samuel declared. "It's obvious you love each other, and we want you to be a proper family." "With us as your children," Thomas added hopefully. "If you'll have us," Maria and Rosa chorused together. Elsie's throat tightened with emotion. Jack looked equally moved, though he tried to hide it behind his usual stoic expression. "Well," he said slowly, kneeling so he was at eye level with the children, "I think that's a fine idea. But I should probably ask Miss Elsie properly first, don't you think?" He turned to Elsie, still on one knee, and took her hand. His calloused fingers were gentle as they clasped hers. "Elsie Whitmore, I came down from that mountain thinking I'd spend the rest of my life alone, punishing myself for not protecting Sarah when she needed me. But you showed me that maybe I deserved a second chance, that maybe Sarah would want me to be happy again, to love again." His voice grew husky. "I love you. I love your kindness, your courage, your enormous heart. Will you marry me? Will you help me raise these children and build the kind of life we both deserve?" Through her tears, Elsie could barely speak, but she managed to whisper, "Yes, yes, of course, yes." The children erupted in cheers, dancing around them in the fading summer light, and as Jack stood and pulled Elsie into his arms, she looked over his shoulder and could have sworn she saw Sarah's face in her mind's eye, smiling with approval. They were married in the fall, when the aspen trees turned the mountains gold. The whole town attended, and even Martha Donnelly managed a grudging smile. Mrs. Chen wept openly, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. The children served as attendants, solemn in their new clothes, bursting with pride. Jack and Elsie combined their households, taking in all 5 children officially. The house rang with laughter and occasional arguments, with the sounds of homework being done at the kitchen table and bedtime stories being read by lamplight. It wasn't always easy raising 5 traumatized children, never is, but it was always filled with love. 2 years later, Elsie gave birth to a daughter. They named her Sarah, in honor of the woman who had connected their lives across time and tragedy. Little Sarah had her father's gray-blue eyes and her mother's generous smile, and she grew up surrounded by siblings who doted on her. The mines of Silver Ridge eventually played out, as all mines do, but by then the town had diversified. Jack helped establish a lumber mill, and Elsie opened a school where she taught reading and arithmetic to the next generation of mountain children. She remembered everything Miss Sarah had taught her, and passed it on with the same gentle patience. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the mountain wind whispered through the pines, Jack and Elsie would sit on their porch and watch the stars emerge. Sometimes they talked about their day, the challenges they'd faced, the small victories they'd won. Sometimes they simply sat in silence, hands clasped, content in each other's presence. "Do you ever think about that day?" Elsie asked one such evening, her head resting on Jack's shoulder. "When you came down from the mountain and changed everything?" Jack was quiet for a moment, considering. "Every day," he admitted. "I think about how close we both came to spending our lives alone, convinced we didn't deserve happiness. How one moment of choosing courage over comfort changed both our futures. And the children's futures," Elsie added, "and maybe even this whole town's future." "Sarah used to say that kindness ripples outward," Jack said softly. "That one good act can touch dozens of lives in ways we never see. I didn't understand what she meant then, but I do now. Elsie squeezed his hand. She'd be proud of you, of us, of the family we've built. I hope so, Jack replied. God, I hope so. Inside the house, they could hear Emma practicing the piano they'd managed to purchase from a family moving east. The tune was halting but earnest, and it made them both smile. Thomas and Samuel were probably still awake, reading by candlelight despite being told to sleep. Maria and Rosa would be curled together in their shared bed, the way they always slept, finding comfort in each other's presence. And little Sarah would be dreaming in her cradle, safe and loved. This was what they'd fought for, Elsie thought. Not just survival, but life, real life, messy and loud and absolutely beautiful. Years later, when Emma was preparing to leave for Teachers College, following in the footsteps of the grandmother she'd never met, she found the old photograph of Sarah Morrison in the attic. She brought it to Elsie and Jack, her face thoughtful. "Tell me about her again," Emma asked, "about how everything connected." So they did, for what must have been the 100th time. They told her about Sarah's kindness, about her unjust death, about how Jack had recognized in Elsie the same spirit of generosity that had first made him fall in love with his first wife. They told her about the false accusation, the trial, the moment when Jack had chosen to intervene rather than remain safely isolated on his mountain. "It's like a circle," Emma said when they finished. Grandmother Sarah taught Mama to be kind, and that kindness saved her when everyone else turned away. And because Dad saved Mama, all of us got saved too. "It's more than a circle," Jack corrected gently. "It's a web. Every kind act, every moment of courage, every time someone chooses love over fear, it all connects." Sarah taught Elsie. I loved Sarah. Elsie saved those children. The children brought us together. And now you're going to go out and teach others, and who knows what circles you'll start. Emma hugged them both fiercely. "I'll make you proud," she promised. "You already have," Elsie assured her. As the years rolled on, the family grew and changed. Samuel became a doctor, determined to help people the way he'd been helped. Thomas took over the lumber mill, proving to have a natural head for business. Maria and Rosa opened a restaurant together, serving the kind of hearty, generous meals they'd once only dreamed of. And little Sarah, true to her namesake, became a teacher like her mother and the grandmother she'd never known. Jack and Elsie grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies growing slower, but their hearts remaining full. On their 25th anniversary, the whole town gathered to celebrate a far cry from the day they'd nearly driven Elsie away. "Speech!" someone called, and the crowd took up the chant. "Speech! Speech!" Jack stood, pulling Elsie up beside him. He looked out at the assembled faces, children and grandchildren, old friends and new neighbors, the entire community they'd helped build. 25 years ago, he began, his voice still strong despite his years, I was a broken man living alone on a mountain, convinced I'd lost everything worth having. And this woman, he squeezed Elsie's hand, she was being driven from her home by people who should have known better. Some in the crowd had the grace to look ashamed, remembering. But something happened that day that changed everything, not just for us, but for this whole town. We all learned that people are worth more than our assumptions about them, that kindness matters more than comfort, that family isn't always about blood, it's about showing up day after day and choosing to love even when it's hard. He turned to Elsie, his eyes bright with unshed tears. You taught me that, my love. You and Sarah both. And I'm grateful for every single day I've gotten to spend proving I learned the lesson." Elsie stood on her toes to kiss his weathered cheek. "We learned it together," she said, "and we'll keep learning it every day for as long as we have." The celebration lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and enough food to feed twice the assembled crowd. And when it was finally over, when the last guests had gone home and the children had helped clean up, Jack and Elsie walked slowly back to their house, hand in hand. The mountains rose dark against the star-filled sky, eternal and unchanging, but the people who lived in their shadow had changed, had learned and grown, and become better versions of themselves. And it had all started with one man choosing to come down from his isolation and defend a woman who needed defending. With one woman choosing kindness, even when it cost her everything. "No regrets?" Jack asked, as they stood on their porch one last time before heading inside. Elsie looked at the life they'd built, the home full of love and laughter, the children who had grown into remarkable adults, the community they'd helped transform, and smiled. "Not a single one," she said. And it was true.